What's going on, guys? Back today. Why do I always put my arm up here? I don't know. What are we doing today? Well, we could install this thing, but that would make sense. But we're not going to do that today. Instead, we're gonna come over here and we're gonna uninstall our power steering rack and depower it. Yeah, so I've been putting this job off for quite a while. I depowered my rack and did it the lazy man's way and looped all the lines and stuff, which I'll show you how to do once I pull the rack out and I can just show you all the lines. I also have been meaning to open up the rack and cut out the bushing in it, so we're gonna do that today, which is gonna be a big long process probably. And then I'm gonna put the turbo back in like the next video, just simply because it's a lot easier to get to the rack and stuff with the turbo out because it kind of gets in the way for the steering shaft that comes out of your firewall. Before we start, what this is gonna do is it's gonna make it a little bit easier to turn the steering wheel for me, make the steering a little bit more responsive rather than as stiff to pull. Because right now it's actually pretty stiff, and if I decide I don't like this mod, I'll just go buy another steering rack and fix it up anyway, because I've already like cut all the lines on mine, and it was kind of dumb, but that's okay. So I don't know if I want power steering back in it or not at some point. Maybe someday we'll do an electric power steering conversion, but today's not the day. So anyway, we're gonna start pulling it out, and I'm gonna start off just by pulling off the splash tray pull off the splash tray that's below the car, and we're gonna start there. Okay, so under tray's out. Next step is to come up here, and from up top, you'll see the steering rack right here, which is this rod coming out of the firewall. And there's one nut on it right here, or a bolt, that you need to loosen up. I don't think you need to remove it all the way because it looks like it just clamps down onto a spline. And this is a 12 millimeter. So that's the one fun thing from up above the car. Now everything else is down below. So next step is to loosen up the tie rod ends and untwist the outer tie rods. Next step is to remove that nut, or to loosen it from your outer tie rod end, and then we are going to back the tie rod out of the outer tie rod end. And so to do this, you need a 17 mil for this and a 19 mil to hold on to this, and you'll just hang on to this while you loosen this. And then once that's cracked loose, you can use a 12 millimeter to back the tie rod out. Oh, and pro tip, when you're backing these out, if you're trying to kind of save your alignment to drive it down to an alignment shop, I actually ordered tools to do my own alignment. You would back this nut all the way out and then mark the inside of the thread so you can get it as close as possible, so it'll be as drivable as possible down to your local alignment shop. But like I said, I'm going to be doing that myself, so we're not going to be doing that. I don't really care about my alignment right now. Once your stuff comes out like this, which should just come out clean, disconnected from your ball joint, you're just going to do the same thing on the other side. Repeat the same exact process. I'm not going to show it to you. I'm not going to show you guys the other side because it's exactly the same, and it's a little bit tighter of a space over there. So once I undo that tie rod, we'll get back to you guys, and I'll show you guys how to pull this out, because it's actually pretty simple. I'm kind of excited to get this job done now. New motivation, let's go! Okay, tie rods are both undone. The rack is basically ready for removal. There's just 4 bolts left to remove, and they are the ones that hold the steering rack in. There's one right down there, there's one up above it, and then there's 2 more on the other side. You can kind of see it past the altimeter. There it is. There's one, and then there's one on the other side. You'll get those from below the car. They're gonna be a 14 millimeter, if I remember right. So I'm gonna go hunt down my 14. Crawl underneath the car, show you those. Okay, so underneath the car, there's one right there. There's one gonna be exactly opposite that, and then there's one right here. And then there's one opposite that too. 14 mil, like I said. and a steering rack. So this thing's absolutely filthy, just got it out of the car. But to see the lazy man's way of depowering the steering rack, you just simply loop these two lines together, and that'll keep because the bushing's somewhere like in between these, and that'll keep the fluid pushing back and forth. And then the same with up here, there's these two smaller lines in the back, you chop them off and just loop them together, and then you can plug these other two holes right here, which are low pressure lines normally. A cheater way of depowering the rack without removing it from the car or messing with your alignment, and just simply remove all the power steering stuff. And that's how you do the cheater way of depowering it, but it leaves a lot of resistance because there's a bushing or right inside here that drags on the inside of these tubes as you slide the rack back and forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this all apart and we're going to cut that bushing out. But before we get started on that, we're going to clean some of this grime off of here and make this thing at least a little bit nicer to work on, because it's kind of gross. Okay, so next step is to start removing the dust boots. Just clamp there and then undo the twisty thingy right over here. Okay. Next up is to undo our clamp over here and undo our twisty thing, and then it should. Now these, if you can see, are your inner tie rods, and you need to, there's kind of like a little piece of metal right here that's folded over, so we gotta actually undo those little tabs, and there's 4 sides like that. Okay, so relocated to the vise. Okay, so we relocated this thing to the vise. Essentially, now that we have our crush washer thing off or loosened, essentially just grab a big old crescent wrench, stick it on your inner tie rod, and just simply twist it off. And it shouldn't be that bad. And I wish I had inner tie rod spacers at the moment, because now's the time to do them. So I would highly suggest, if you're going to put inner tie rod spacers in, do them at the same time as doing this. So I'm going to have to go back and do this twice later on when I add angle to my car, because I want to do that. Okay, so once you get your tie rod off, you're going to take your steering rack and flip it over. And you're going to do the same thing on the other side. And same thing, crescent wrench, and here we go, just completely loose. Set these guys aside. Okay, and then there is another 12mm right here that holds the pinion onto the rack, or the, whatever you want to call this piece. I'm not an expert, so anyway, remove the nut, or the bolt, all the way from that. Set that aside, and then just pull it up, and you have your joint. Okay, now you take your absurdly big crescent wrench, which I just had to go buy because I didn't have anything that fit this, and you are trying to take off this nut here. There's 2 parts. There's the center section and then this outside part. Just trying to crack loose this center section. So put it on here and just give her a good old yank, and she's loose. And you may get some weeping because there's probably still a little fluid in here, or water in my case from pressure washing. Now there's an adjuster bolt in the center, and you just take a 14mm and you just want to take that out. And those are the pieces that came out. So I'm going to set these off to the side, and then this piece comes out. That's good for this section. Rotate your rack in the thing, and you want to be able to get to this bottom one. This guy right here. Now this is, I believe, a 21. 17 mil for this guy. And then once you got all that off, then we're gonna flip the rack one more time. And we're gonna come back to this side. If you can see it, there's a really dirty snap ring in here. And we're just gonna use a pair of snap ring pliers to pull her out. Now that that's all done, this should come out, and there's your pinion. So once your pinion's out, we're gonna flip the rack over one more time. And this time we're looking at this little hole that's here. And on the inside of this hole, there is a small snap ring, or I don't know if you wanna call it a snap ring. It's kinda like a snap ring, but it doesn't have the little hooks that a snap ring does. There's a little port here on the side that I'm trying to fish in, and you can kind of pop the ring up. Here's your ring that you normally would have in there. Okay, so now your rack should be ready to fully come apart. Essentially just have a giant sleeve here with probably a couple bearings in it. Pull that out, set that aside. All right, and there she is. And this whole job was just to actually get to this little guy right here, this little sleeve. So we're actually going to basically just remove this sleeve, and that is actually how you depower the rack. Now there is another step you can take, and that's welding the pinion, if I remember right. I'm not gonna go that far. There's like a very, very, very tiny bit of play in the pinion, in the hydraulic ones. And you can go ahead and like weld it so that it stays together, but A, I'm out of gas, and B, I just don't feel like welding it. It just seems like a lot of extra work for a very, very tiny amount of play. So you can remove the housing from here, and now we're gonna remove all of these little fittings, because the heck with them. And bro. And now, okay, same drill. We're going to close it out, and close them up, one more, and one last. Last part of the disassembly, guys. We just gotta cut this ring off. Now what this does, this is actually a seal, and when this is inside of your rack, it has fluid on either side, and as you turn, it pushes fluid onto one side, helping assist it to push the steering rack in or out. Now with a manual rack, this is just drag, so this is actually binding on the inside of that, and obviously like we've drained a lot of the fluid, so it's not even lubricated very well anymore. So for our benefit, for the fact that I've already depowered this rack, we're gonna chop this off, and this should hopefully make the steering a little bit better for me. And to do that, angle grinder. Now be super careful and have fun. Ta-da! Okay, so once everything's apart, it should look all kind of something like this. All this junk. And now we get to do the fun part of putting it all back together. So, it wasn't terrible. Probably total time invested to tearing it down was maybe an hour. Not really too bad actually overall. It's just needing a big crescent wrench. That was the only specialty kind of tool that it just didn't have for it. I'm going to go ahead and get started cleaning this thing up and putting it back together. The only thing extra that you're going to need to put it back together is a little grease and maybe something to fill the holes with on the steering rack housing that we removed all the fittings from. I'm personally just going to fill them with JB Weld, and it should just keep the dirt out, any muck out, and that should help keep the steering rack all cleaned up. Okay, so as you can see, here's all our fun parts to go ahead and reassemble this. We're gonna start with the piece that came out last, the shaft. We're gonna grease all of the teeth here. We're gonna grease the tube, just a light coat because it does slide through some portions and it wouldn't hurt. Just using some good old automotive grease. Nothing special, nothing fancy. Gonna take our housing and we're gonna start at the side where the pinion doesn't come in. Now we want to take our sleeve over here that we pulled out from this end, and we just want to give it a quick wipe down to get all this hydraulic fluid off of it. And we're gonna put a light coating of grease on this so it helps slide in better. This is a very messy job if you haven't figured this out, so getting gloves may not be the worst idea for y'all. And we're just gonna slide this in. We can take our little ring here and go ahead and slide this in. You should hear it snap into place once it's seated in there. Now it's time for the pinion. And just like before, we're gonna grease up all these. I didn't clean these up the best, but they're not terrible. Go ahead and stick that back in its home down in here, which you may have to jiggle all this stuff around to get it to find its like happy little home. Don't forget to clean off your top here. I forgot to, it's kind of gross. Okay, so we're gonna put our nut on the bottom here to help snug all this down. And then once that's done, you want to press this. You want to press the inner collar right here inside in. And we're going to put our snap ring back in place. Okay. Next up, the dust shield just slips over. Okay, so next up, dust cap over the bottom nut. Just go ahead and screw that guy in there. So next we gotta drop our tensioner in, and this is the part that we gotta get right. So it obviously only slides in one way. Come on. There it goes. Okay, and put our washer back in. Put our spring on top. We take our adjustment nut and we start threading this, and we just want to put this on. We don't want to put the collar on yet. Now we're gonna go to, I think it's like 45 inch-pounds roughly, but I don't have an inch-pound wrench. I've got a foot-pound wrench. So we're gonna go to like 4 foot-pounds, which is like real close to that mark. And it's too tight, so we're gonna back it off. So we're gonna back it off about a 1/16 of a turn, so just a smidge, and we should feel, okay, maybe a smidge more because we can't move it still. Okay, so next up we're gonna put the lock ring on, and we're just gonna hand thread that very carefully, not to spin the center section, because we don't want to spin this. Then we're gonna take our big old crescent wrench right here, slide it on there. We're gonna hold this and spin this at the same time. Double check your movement, make sure it still spins fairly freely. Next up is going to be your boot, which this is the one that slides into the steering shaft. It's got 2 nuts, just make sure they're unthreaded all the way. and just slide it on there and tighten it down, 12 millimeter. And last but not least is to put your tie rods on. These just thread all the way into the ends on the big side here. Sorry, neighbors. These just thread all the way in on the big side here, and then you fold these over with like a hammer onto these. So you gotta make sure that these all line up, and then you just stick the boot over. So I believe these are the same length. Yeah, they're the same length. So it doesn't matter which side's which. So anyway, once you have your tie rod threaded on, make sure you smash down this washer, and then we're just gonna simply put the dust boot over it, like we did on this side. There's a clamp here, and then you may want to put like some metal wire, some tie wire right there, and wrap that side up so it doesn't come loose, which I'm going to do in a second. So the last thing to do before we can put this rack back in is we have all of these holes and ports right here. That one, and these three. I'm going to personally mix up some JB Weld, 1:1 ratio, and I'm just going to smudge it in the holes just to keep the dirt out, the dust out. It'll help make it easier, and it's cheaper than trying to find bolts to fill the holes. And then once that's done, we're ready to put the rack back into the car actually, and this project's almost done. Okay, the rack is all put back together. Now it's just time to put it back in the car. I filled all the holes with JB Weld. There's one, they all kind of look real similar to that. Yeah, so they're all filled with JB Weld to keep the dust and dirt out. I'm not converting this thing back to a manual rack clearly because I already cut the bushing out of it. It would just make more sense to just buy another manual rack because they're not that expensive in the first place. Sorry, my neighbors are being obnoxious. Now we just gotta install it in that thing. Okay, so before we get started installing this, one thing to make note of is the bushings that actually hold the rack onto your subframe are actually a different shape on the inside. So this one goes around here, and this one goes over here, where it actually has kind of an oblong shape. Okay guys, so steering rack is ready to install. Once you got the whole steering rack put back together, you put your JB Weld on, or whatever your choice of covering the holes is. Come into your interior, make sure your steering wheel is straight, like where you want it, because this is how you're going to straighten your steering wheel, or at least get it mostly straight, and then we'll finish out the adjustments with the tie rod ends. You also want to make sure your steering rack is actually centered. Now, how I did it was kind of like the lazy man's way. You can take all this and measure and figure some stuff out, but if you know the Miata rack is just take it and spin it all the way to one side, and then once it's there, so here's all the way to one side, now spin it all the way to the other side and count how many times it comes around. So if this is your 360-degree position, you're gonna go, okay, that's about half a turn, 1, half, 2, and roughly a half. So now we know that we need to go back about 1 1/4 turn. So if we go back, there's half, there's 1 1/4-ish. Should be right around there. And that should be center. And it doesn't have to be exact, but just about. And then you want to try to set up this clamp to be in the best position as possible. And we're going to slide this through first. Okay, so once you have the bar or the steering rack all installed, when you do it, make sure you get the steering shaft into the steering rack done first, because it's going to be your biggest issue most likely. Because if you mounted this, you wouldn't have enough room to pull it back to put it in, so you got to put it in before you mount this. So anyway, once this is all mounted up, the last thing you got to do is thread your outer tie rod, or your tie rods into your outer tie rods, and reset your alignment. And I'm gonna go ahead and thread mine in, and I'm not doing my alignment today, but you're gonna probably need to get your car aligned, or you should, or align it yourself. I don't have the alignment tools yet, and I actually have some more work that I need to do on the suspension on this car. I'm going to align it myself a little later on. I'm gonna go ahead and finish this up though, and then I'm gonna check back in with you guys when I'm done. Okay guys, just got the steering rack back in, super excited. Feels pretty good just spinning it back and forth as it sits. Won't really know until I actually drive it if it feels better or not. But I'll update you guys when I actually get a chance to drive it. Clearly we still have to put a turbo in it, and I still have to align it. And I've got some other things that I want to do before I do the alignment, because I have other parts sitting in boxes over there. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, guys. Thanks for watching if you guys made it this far. Shout out to those 15 subscribers of you guys. Hopefully we can get to 20 one of these days. Working on it. Super excited though. Thank you to everybody. Peace out. I'll see you guys next time.